Welcome to the program DCTP at the Republica 2014. My next guest is Ron Deibert. Welcome to the program, Ron.
Thank you for having me.
You're the founder of the Citizen Lab with the University of Toronto, an author. Black Code is your fourth book. First, let's start with Citizen Lab. Many might have heard it. Explain what it is, please.
Citizen Lab is a very unusual place. It is an interdisciplinary research lab. We do very specialized research, forensic research on cybersecurity issues, but from the perspective of human rights and from civil society. So we're interested in topics like the extent to which governments are censoring communications online, trying to empirically document what content they're blocking. We've done studies identifying the manufacturers, the vendors of censorship and surveillance technology. We've developed a way to actually fingerprint where the equipment is and who sells it to regimes that use it to spy on people. We've done very detailed analyses of threats to human rights organizations, their computers being targeted, and we investigate, find evidence of malware, and try to document it and publicize it to raise awareness.
And there's another well-known lab with the MIT, which is funded, not completely, I guess, but mostly from military sources. Where is your money coming from?
Our money comes entirely from foundations and research funds. We don't take government contracts. We don't do work for corporations in order to remain independent and impartial. So we mostly research foundations.
You held a talk here at the Republica about the latest developments in the post-Snowden era.
Yeah.
So what are these developments you have in mind? Who's acting and how?
Well, so I think for most people, it's certainly raised awareness about things that were happening in secret. And there are more conversations now about signals intelligence agencies in just about every country in the world that weren't happening before. So that's mostly a positive development. I think there have been many unforeseen negative consequences. So here in Germany, of course, there's lots of talk about detaching from US companies and US networks, Schengen routing, and data localization, which can be a good thing, but it can also be used as an excuse to put in place greater nationalized controls. Maybe not here in Germany, but countries in the global south will see that as a convenient excuse to put in place,
Russia will argument this.
Russia, India, Indonesia, Arab countries, and we're seeing it happening now. And of course, other countries look upon it differently than the average person does. So if you put yourself in the position of the head of state of an African country, they would probably say to their chief of security, "Are we being spied on by the NSA?" And the chief of security would say, "I can answer that question, but I need $25 million in new surveillance equipment. And by the way, it'll help you monitor your citizens." And so the market for essentially spyware and the tools that are used to engage in intelligence tradecraft is growing very quickly.
Already now.
Yes.
You see this already.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that we've saw it before, the Snowden revelations, and I think it's being amplified now.
And who's selling what to whom?
That's part of the research that we try to do at the Citizen Lab, is empirically document that. So, the obvious way you could go about doing that type of research is to look on websites, try to find contracts, interview people, and so on. We've developed a very clever way of scanning the internet to look for essentially a fingerprint that tells us this manufacturer, this equipment is installed on this computer in this country. And if it's a technology like deep packet inspection, and we know what the company is, if we publish a report about it, then the company cannot deny that its products are there. They have some explaining to do. So which companies are doing this? Well, mostly US, European, Canadian companies. One of our recent reports I talked about in my speech yesterday found that the Pakistan government, which is one of the world's worst censors of the internet, purchased censorship equipment from a Canadian company called NetSweeper. And for most people, they're surprised by that. A Canadian company runs the Pakistan Great Firewall, if you will.
And what do we do about it?
So some people are now talking about export controls. Here in Germany, it's a big topic, I know, and Europe generally. That's one way that you can address the issue is by...
Is it just a matter of willing, or are there some other technical, legal issues that makes the export of these kind of dual-use technology special?
Well, there are lots of dual-use technologies. A helicopter can be a dual-use technology. A firearm, right? You can use it for many things. So it's nothing new about the fact that it's dual-use. However, it is difficult when we're talking about software as the product, because you're talking about information. It's very difficult to control. It's easy to send to many different places around the world.
And you once check it and you don't know whether the one that is exported is really that one you checked.
That's right,
so
and companies could say it's a stolen copy, it's not, we didn't sell it, or a third party sold it. So it's a bit more complicated. But like the other dual-use industries, there are companies with headquarters and shareholders and investors, and you can hold those people to account. So you can have export controls and sanctions.
Okay, the other thing is, one is the increase of spy technology and surveillance technology, and the other one you mentioned is the balkanizing, the danger of the internet being balkanized. What would you suggest to do about it?
Well, I think it's going to be very difficult to reverse, actually. I'm quite pessimistic about it, because we're only at the beginning of a major tsunami, I think, is happening. How to reverse it? I think it has to happen at multiple levels. I think we have to think about the technological layer and encourage the innovation around security products and the widespread use of encryption. We need to think about it in terms of local laws, getting our own houses in order in places like Canada and Germany, making sure we know what our signals intelligence agencies and our companies are doing before we start criticizing governments abroad. And then we have to work on the international political layer, making sure that governance of the internet is open, it's truly multi-stakeholder, not just something run by governments. And that will take a lot of effort by citizens all around the world. To do.
Some say it's as hard as to regulate the climate change, which took us, I don't know, many decades, and we're still not working. Still not working.
I think it's the same here, actually. I'm quite pessimistic. I have been monitoring, researching this area all my professional career, and I've seen it get progressively worse. It is very much like climate change. There's a degradation of the global communications environment going on through censorship, surveillance, and militarization. There's an arms race in cyberspace. We need to think about arms control and a kind of environmental protection of this ecosystem that surrounds us.
There was this conference in Net Mondial.
Yes.
A couple of days or weeks ago, which was which tried to really establish such a global multi-stakeholder, not regulation, but to find a consensus on what has to be done to maintain the free internet, or to get it back, basically. Some civil rights activists were pretty disappointed. Others said, well, it's more than we expected. How do you see it, the outcome?
More or less the same, actually, a bit mixed. I think it was the first event that you truly did have open input into the final document. And from what I heard, I didn't attend, but from colleagues of mine who attended, they said they've never experienced anything like that, and they see this as a victory for civil society. Other people with whom I've spoken that attended said, actually, when real decisions were made, governments still did it behind closed doors. The fact of the matter is, just like in climate change, it's very difficult to organize constituencies and stakeholders from so many different varieties of life and from around the world to agree on even the process, let alone the outcome. So this is going to be hard. And meanwhile, I think real governance happens from below. So those meetings are important, but they are only one slice of what happens. Real governance happens on the ground. in countries like this, in ministries, in agencies, inside the equipment, in the technology, in the standards and regulations and so on. So there's much more governance that happens in a distributed fashion that I feel is even more important than meetings like that.
Okay. Coming back to the developments in this post-Snowden era, you find not very encouraging. One is balkanization, increasing surveillance. What else?
Well, one thing that worries me is that the idea of mass surveillance now being exposed is at risk of being normalized, right? So before people kind of suspected it, paranoid people talked about it. Now we know it's true. Everything we do is monitored.
And we get used to it.
And now that's the new normal. And I think there's no way Edward Snowden could have anticipated that, but it is one of the ironic consequences of it. If you saw the speech of President Obama where he issued the reforms, one thing that caught my eye was how he said metadata collection has to happen. We are going to do this, and we may store it somewhere. And you're like, when did that happen? When did we agree on this, right? Yeah. So now it's become normal for governments to collect and access information that is essentially collected by private sector companies.
So it's more like 3 steps forward and 1 step back, and then it towards surveillance and mass surveillance.
Yes.
And a small reform, 1 step back, but then three steps forward. Okay.
And I think, again, it's inevitable to some degree that this would happen. You cannot. Only a naive person would think, with all of this data that we exhaust around ourselves, we leave a digital trail wherever we go. Of course, government agencies are going to want to have access to that data. So now is the time of reckoning. We have to think about and this is why it's not a technological issue. It's a political question that goes back to ancient Greece. How do we structure government? What is accountability? What is proper oversight? The relationship between citizens and the state. These are timeless questions that we have to address now in a new technological environment. And I think we haven't, as a society, really, I'm talking about all Western societies, haven't had that conversation yet. It's as if we need a new social contract around this.
How would that social contract look like?
Well, again, I think we don't need to invent anything new. We just need to make sure that, for example, you cannot call yourself a liberal democracy if something so basic to a liberal democracy as a warrant and a judge looking at when police agencies access personal information, effectively do a search. You can't call yourselves a liberal democracy if you don't have that assurance in place. In Canada, just to use my own country as an example, we found out that government agencies access user data from telecommunications companies millions of times a year without a warrant. Millions of times a year, routinely. So this is astonishing. If this is happening in Canada, I'm not sure about the situation in Germany, but it's probably more or less the same in many other countries. And that's a big problem. And do you think it's a structural flaw at the heart of our democracy?
Okay, so you would say we have to reestablish like the balance of power to control those powers within the government, like the secret services.
Yeah.
And we kind of lost track we were too loose on those principles. But do you think the outcry is loud enough to get this back?
Not right now. I think that there are contradictory pressures. So you have people now not that surprised about surveillance. I think because we're kind of used to giving away information already through consent. People post on their Facebook all the time, this is my place of work, here's my dog, this is my friend, this is, So we live in a auto surveillance society, if you will, already. And so it's not like this came out of nowhere. And people were accustomed to it as well through fiction, through television. What I think needs to happen is some evidence of abuse. If the government is using this information to do something along the lines of a Watergate scandal, then I think that might trigger reforms. But until then, we will only see gradual piecemeal reforms. And of course, the hard reality is most of the governments in the world are not democratic to begin with. Many of them are sliding back into authoritarianism. Look at places like Thailand, Indonesia, India, countries that are going through massive growth in internet technologies. They're the ones that are going to be shaping the technologies that we use here very soon. And in those places, it's even more difficult to talk about proper accountability.
When you talk about the Watergate, some people, just to use this analogy to the climate change again, some people say, well, what we need is a Chernobyl to take the ship around, to turn the ship around. And now you say, well, we would need something like a big scandal, but we have those scandals, haven't we? I mean, the phones of, I don't know, 30 or 40
heads of state
are being tapped. The NSA is manipulating countless of routers and hardware around the internet.
Right.
They're injecting code and malicious software into real-time internet conversation. What worse could happen?
Well, I think what you're talking about demonstrates the awesome power of the NSA. They have a intelligence budget of $50 billion a year. They have extraordinary home field advantage. The question is, are they abusing that information in some manner? Are they collecting it and then doing something?
And we don't have really no evidence.
We don't really know. Well, you tell me. I haven't seen something extraordinarily bad. That's not to say it might not be happening, but I think until there's some kind of major consequence that demonstrates to people why this is bad, we will only have piecemeal reform. Some, groups of people being sent abroad, rendition and tortured, something like that, might cause some kind of alarm.
And do you think it's enough? Because some people already say right now, well, I plan to go to the US in 3 weeks. Maybe should I take part on this Facebook, not demonstration, but should I paste this critic about the Obama talk maybe on Facebook, or maybe should I really take part in this demonstration because I heard that a friend of mine heard that he was being questioned at the airport.
Right.
This kind of development is already going on and people are already talking about it.
Self-censoring.
Yeah. Do you think this would be enough for people to really change?
I don't think so. I think that's the tricky character of surveillance. It can creep slowly into one's life.
Very silent.
Very silent. It's not like with something like internet censorship. I can't get to that website. It's very frustrating. I want to get to YouTube, but I can't. But when you're being watched, it's difficult to feel it, to sense it, and the consequences can be very indirect. I worry about pre-crime, that sometime down the road, profiles will be developed of people before they do something wrong, and they will be constrained in certain ways.
Because there's a certain likelihood that the
algorithm
have from historic data have derived a certain probability that those persons might in the future, because other persons who showed the same data in the past have committed a crime.
That's right.
So,
and if you have enough big data, it's conceivable you could start constructing algorithms that do that sort of thing.
Is this already happening?
It's definitely already happening when it comes to things like drone strikes. So if you look at the shift from Bush to Obama when it came to the war on terror, one of the unnoticed elements of it was the shift in drone strikes, where new technologies allowed signature strikes. So rather than having a drone target an individual per se, it targets a pattern. This is a suspicious set of activities and cell phone records happening in this vicinity. We know that that's likely to be a terrorist or a terrorist sympathizer. We're going to blow up that house. And of course, we've seen lots of civilian casualties and errors made because of that.
In your talk, you mentioned apart from states and companies, you mentioned other rogue actors, criminals, who also changed their behavior or increased their behavior in the post-Snowden area. How and who?
So there are, there is a huge underworld of cybercrime that most of us, again, don't really see or experience directly. It's very profitable. It can happen in many different jurisdictions around the world because of lack of law enforcement. And you have people can hide locally while connecting and committing crimes globally. And I think that the techniques of cybercrime, tradecraft, are indistinguishable from the techniques that are used by the NSA to inject viruses into communication packets that you talked about. It's basically indistinguishable, except for the fact that the cyber criminals don't package it in a brochure and sell it at trade shows. And so now we're seeing companies emerge that come from this area, that are working for the defense intelligence agencies, essentially refining and polishing up the tradecraft of cybercrime.
Okay, and who might also profit from the fact that the state authorities are not always willing to close security holes if they find some.
We have a big problem with cybersecurity overall, how it's conceptualized, and just look around us, all of this technology, we're all connected to each other. I saw a statistic, there's something like 15 billion devices connected to the internet. Our refrigerators, our cars, glasses, hospitals, electronic grids. Thinking about how to secure all of that is mind-boggling, because the code that's embedded in it, millions of lines of code that was written years ago, mixed next to newer code, and it just is an extraordinary challenge. I'm not quite sure how we're ever going to address it properly. Meanwhile, the scary thing is, major militaries, armed forces, are standing up within their units, agencies whose job it is to find and exploit those vulnerabilities. That's part of the arms race in cyberspace. We saw the first act of sabotage in cyberspace with the Stuxnet virus, the attack on the Iranian nuclear enrichment facility. How long before that becomes more common?
For those people who are watching now and all concerned about it, what do you suppose to do? Like act locally, or
run for the hills? No. I really believe acting locally is the way to go. I think we tend to think of just like climate change. Actually, I like the analogy. One of the problems people had with environment is it's so big. How do we address it? It's daunting. Same with this, but I think the thing to do is start locally, just as we do with the environment. Be a steward of your own cyberspace, if you will, and that begins with your own devices and the choices you make online, not accepting it at face value, lifting the lid on it, understanding what happens when you send that tweet. Where does it go? With whom is the data shared? Through what tubes does it travel, and who has access to it? Are all very important questions that citizens can exercise their rights about and answer for themselves.
Ron Deibert, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure. Yeah, thank you. Nice to meet you.
Okay. Thanks very much for watching. This was Ron Deibert from the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto. My name is Philip Banse. Thank you very much for watching. You find the videos at dctp.tv or in our YouTube channel, DCTP. See you later if you like. Thanks for watching. Bye.